Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut-Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series in which we give Precon decks a glow-up without breaking the bank. My name's Grazzet, and today we'll be giving the Modern Horizons 3 Graveyard Overdrive Precon $35 worth of upgrades to bring it up to cut-rate standards. As usual though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content. Please consider supporting the channel directly either via my Buy Me a Coffee or Game Nerds affiliate links in the description if you really like it, and be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commander we'll be covering next and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. Also, if you'd like to see my blind reaction and thoughts to the Precon itself before any upgrades, you can do so by checking out my first impressions of it also in the description. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. This deck's face commander is Disa the Restless, a 5/6 human scout that costs 2 and Jund with the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever a Lhurgoyf permanent card is put into our graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, we put it onto the battlefield. And secondly, whenever one or more creatures we control deal combat damage to a player, we create a Tarmogoyf token. Breaking down her core stats, Disa is sporting a decently hefty CMC, an average power and above average toughness stat block for her cost, and a pair of Lhurgoyf themed abilities that can get us more goyfs into play via her token creation and a tribal reanimation, all of which benefit from the graveyard-centric game plan of this deck. Taking a closer look at her second ability first, the ability to spawn up to 3-star ones whose stats scale with the amount of card types in all graveyards is pretty terrifying, potentially allowing her to spawn 3 9/10s if we happen to hit all 9 card types across all players' bins. Those types being land, creature, instant, sorcery, artifact, enchantment, kindred, planeswalker, and battle, which to be fair is unlikely, but can still realistically net us 1 to 3 4/5s or 5/6s in conjunction with some decent graveyard setup, which is still a considerable amount of stats to put on the table each turn at no mana cost by us just turning our creatures sideways. That then brings us to Disa's first ability, which on paper is an amazing tribal payoff, allowing us to reanimate any Lhurgoyf permanent, which includes kindred spells, at no mana cost if they're milled, discarded, tutored to our graveyard from our deck, or even sent to the bin from exile if we want to get cute with Mimic Vat. But then, when we actually look at the pool of Lhurgoyfs we currently have in the game, it will quickly become apparent that there are not a whole lot of them, and that there are some that are questionable to run to say the least. And that list is also including changelings, with a handful of notable exceptions we'll be discussing later. Meaning that, in my opinion at least, we simply don't have enough good Lhurgoyfs in the game at this time to get the maximum usage out of this effect, and we should consider it simply a nice piece of upside alongside the tribe's handful of good members, rather than reducing the overall quality of our deck by including subpar Lhurgoyfs and changelings. So instead, in this upgrade, we'll be primarily focused on expanding the graveyard-centric portion of our game plan to empower the Tarmogoyf tokens our commander creates and the small suite of good Lhurgoyfs already included in the base build, while simultaneously generating us value, in which we'll be adding more ways to get cards into our bin via self-mill and graveyard tutors to beef up our goyfs, as well as more ways to recur and or reanimate our cards from the bin so we can repeatedly take advantage of the powerful bodies included in the core build. That said, we will be making some small adjustments to the Lhurgoyf portion of our game plan, mostly consisting of adding in some of the better tribe members not included in the base build, alongside some of the more powerful changelings in our colors so we can proc Disa's first ability just a bit more often for the free value, which will go a long way in augmenting Disa's already powerful arsenal so she can really jund out our opponents. So let us make our way back into Dominaria's history, to the time of the Ice Age, where the plane was ravaged by an eternal winter as a result of Urza's Silex blast at the end of the Brothers' War. It is here, in this unforgiving time in Dominaria's history, that we'll find Disa, an explorer, a scout, and the predominant writer of this dark time. And while the tales of her exploits are many, ranging from her exploration of the frozen continent of Terrasare, to her becoming the adoptive mother of Kesa, the future druid who would end the Ice Age by casting the world spell alongside Freyalise, one of the lesser-known aspects of her life was her vast knowledge of Lhurgoyfs, one of the most predominant predators of her time. It was said that she would often subdue and tame these fearsome beasts in her travels, using them as guides and guardians as she traversed the the Frozen Wastes, a feat previously believed impossible and yet being a mere footnote in the rich life of the legend known then and now as Disa the Restless. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's jump straight into the upgrades. Starting off our upgrades on the graveyard-focused side of things, the very first thing we'll be doing is adding in a suite of cards geared towards filling up our bin to both empower our token and non-token Lhurgoyfs, as well as to set the groundwork so we can later generate value from it. As such, we'll be cutting Find and Finality, which functions as a passable wipe or piece of recursion, but we have better access to both in our colors, along with Burnished Heart, which I personally like as both a creature and artifact in order to provide a +2/+2 stat bump to our Tarmogoyfs while also ramping us, but it loses out to its replacements, the dredge spells Golgari Grave Troll and Life from the Loam, both of which we can mill over and or discard with no issues to provide even more graveyard setup as we dredge them back to our hand to build up our graveyard even further. The former fueling its own stats as we fill up our bin with creatures to swing in alongside our Lhurgoyfs, and the latter allowing us to recur our self-sacking and or cycling lands from the bin to be used again and again for more fixing and value. Then from there, we'll be raising one of our excess lands, Temple of Malice, to make space for the new Ripples of Undeath, which provides the build with even more passive self-mill, while also giving us the option to keep one of the milled cards if we need to, which can be a lifesaver if we mill over a playmaker we won't be able to get back easily, and demolishing the builds to other temples, Temple of Abandon and Temple of Malady, so we can slot in Buried Alive and Splinter Fright in their place, the first giving us access to a powerful graveyard tutor that, alongside Disa, instead functions as a 3-mana way for us to cheat out 3 Lhurgoyfs from our deck directly into play, and the second giving us more passive self-mill to further empower our Goyfs and itself to keep piling on the damage. Now, pivoting ever so slightly into some new additions which can let us recur our cards from the bin for value while staying on the graveyard setup game plan, since there is a lot of overlap, we'll start by scrapping Exterminator Magmarch, which is admittedly an excellent way to generate double the usage out of all our spot removal, though this build simply doesn't have enough of it to properly take advantage of it, so we can bring in 6, whose on attack self-mill and land recursion are decent if and when a safe attack presents itself, but we're mainly running due to their passive ability to grant all our permanent spells retrace so we can turn our dead land draws into impressive value from our bin in the mid to late game, swapping out Bit Blast, which is a cute Jund throwback but not particularly good in this build as a removal piece due to its high cost, to swap in Chainer Nightmare Adept, who lets us cast our creatures from the bin by pitching cards to him, making him an excellent way to get our Lhurgoyfs into the bin to be reanimated by Disa, while also letting Disa and those creatures swing in as soon as they come down to keep the pressure up, and cutting his own Thousand Eyes, who can flood our board with tokens and turn said tokens into card advantage, but just costs too much to warrant her inclusion here, in favor of Nyx Weaver, which counts as both a creature and an enchantment when milled to empower our Lhurgoyfs, provides more passive self-mill to set up our bin, and gives us the option to recur any card from our bin as needed for some limitationless graveyard value. Then, as our last 2 self-milling and recursion pieces, we'll be letting go of Sawhorn Nemesis, whose player-specific damage doubling can be powerful, but isn't really necessary here, since we can increase our damage against all our opponents by simply building up our graveyard in this build, to bring in Kaga Shadow Archdruid, whose on-attack self-mill and self-death touch granting easily allow her to get even more cards into our bin unless our opponents are willing to trade with her, and whose ability to let us play any milled land or cast any milled permanents gives us another way to, at best, cast milled over playmakers, or, at worst, let us more easily make our land drops, and sidelining a Cursed Marauder, whose AoE Edict effect that only hits non-tokens is fantastic, but would find a much better home in a dedicated sacrifice build where it would make the most impact, so we can give it spot to Shigeki Jukai Visionary, who works nicely as a repeatable piece of ramp and graveyard setup early, and who we can later channel to recur a bunch of non-legendary spells from our bin to help reload our hands with. And then to wrap up our selection of graveyard setup spells with an entry that fills up multiple players' bins, we'll be releasing Garruk Apex Predator, whose loyalty abilities may be generically serviceable but don't really do much to further our game plan to warrant his massive mana cost, and replacing him with Breach the Multiverse, which does fit nicely as a way to have all players mill 10 to further empower our Lhurgoyfs, and then lets us reanimate the best creature or planeswalker from each player on top of that to make our board even more terrifying. So, now having covered all of the new graveyard setup and graveyard value generating additions that we've added to the build, let's switch our focus onto the handful of new Lhurgoyf additions that we'll be making in order to both take advantage of all that new graveyard setup and to just get a bit more value out of our commander's free tribal reanimation as we get them into our bin, in which we'll be replacing the 2 goblin-focused Siege Gang Lieutenant and the 2 gimmicky Fork Tempt with Mayhem in favor of the actual Lhurgoyfs, Scrounging Deathclaw and a Terror, the former being a Fallout reskin of the original Tarmogoyf, which we're running due to it being the cheapest version we can buy of it while still remaining within budget, and, just like the Tarmogoyf tokens our commander creates, because it can grow into a sizable threat as we fill up our bin, while the latter takes advantage of all our slow fetches, cycling lands, and lands that will be milling in order to grow itself into a massive trampling threat, as well as cutting the mediocre basic land tutor Yavimaya Elder and the okay but a bit too generic 2-for-1 spell Bloodbraid Elf to make space for the pseudo-Lhurgoyfs Taran Mauler and a Changeling Outcast, both of which are honorary tribe members thanks to being changelings while also being solid creatures in their own right, either thanks to being an ever-growing threat as our opponents cast their spells for us to keep swinging in with, or by being an evasive body we can use to reliably proc Disa's Tarmogoyf token creation turn after turn. And then as our penultimate upgrade to the deck, which may not technically be a Lhurgoyf but does enable our Lhurgoyf game plan, we'll be exchanging out Bloodbraid Challenger, whose repeatable cascade that we can escape with from the bin is decent but not groundbreaking in this build, in which we're more concerned about generating value from our bin, with Conspiracy, which is functionally our second copy of Maskwood Nexus, and, like it, allows us to turn all our creatures into Lhurgoyfs no matter where they are, thereby supercharging our commander's first ability by letting us reanimate any creature that goes to our bin from outside of the battlefield for an insane amount of value. And then as our final new addition to the build, we'll be padding our core stats by cutting Infested Thrinax, whose ETB AoE on death token creation doesn't really fit into what this deck wants to do, so we can add in Garruk's Uprising in its place, whose passive trample granting enables our creatures to more reliably get in for damage to proc Disa's token creation, and, once our tokens get big enough, can draw us up to 3 cards per rotation with just our token generation alone, and even more as we cast our other 4+ power creatures to help keep our hands nice and full. So, now that we've covered all 17 cards which we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 30 cards that care about our graveyard in some capacity, 22 ways to get cards into our graveyard via either self-mill, discard, and graveyard tutoring, and 16 ways to recur and/or reanimate cards from our graveyard, allowing us to build up and generate the maximum amount of mileage out of our bin to fuel this deck's primary game plan, alongside 15 cards that are either Lhurgoyfs themselves or that can turn other creatures into Lhurgoyfs, and 3 cards that care about Lhurgoyfs, which help enable Disa's tribal reanimation to generate us some additional value as we play into the graveyard aspect of our deck without it becoming the central focus. For general deck stats, we have 13 ramp sources, 7 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, with only our draw being slightly below average in this build, which isn't too much of an issue as we're going to be generating most of our value from our graveyard anyway. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.44, leaving us with a lower mid-weight curve that wants to get Disa on board as quickly as possible, so we can then start filling up our bin aggressively to empower the Tarmogoyf tokens she creates as she and our other creatures get in for damage. Then the game plan from there is pretty straightforward, consisting of us getting more cards into our bin via graveyard setup, generating value from said bin through our recursion and reanimation pieces, and building up our board with bigger and bigger Lhurgoyfs that we either create or that we reanimate, amassing us a bigger and bigger board with each passing turn until our opponents are simply overrun by our horde of hungry Lhurgoyfs and their reanimated allies. The final price of this build then comes out to be $84.46 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $50, which is the lowest price I could find at the time of this recording. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we want to add even more upgrades to the build by going over budget, we can trade out Maelstrom Pulse for Tortured Existence as a low-budget upgrade, which is fantastic in this build as both another recursion piece and a repeatable way for us to recur then reanimate our Lhurgoyfs by pitching them to it in order to recur another creature. Gluttonous Hellkite can be swapped out for Grist Voracious Larva as a moderate upgrade, who will be able to easily transform thanks to Disa and our suite of cast from graveyard sources, turning her into a source of repeatable mill, spot removal, and, eventually, a graveyard payoff that we can use to flood our board with token copies of all the creatures in our bin, and, as our priciest upgrade, we can slot out Chandra's Ignition in favor of Ashes of the Fallen, giving us our third copy of Maskwood Nexus to ensure we'll be able to reanimate our entire creature base with Disa most games, with the added benefit that it won't cost us an arm and a leg to do so. Unlike a certain tree I could mention, no, think happy thoughts. The Great Henge is good in every green build, but is not notably good here. Okay, I'm good. But seriously, f that tree. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Graveyard Overdrive Precon upgrade complete, it's back to our regularly scheduled builds, and to kick us off, we have one featuring last week's poll winner, Coram the Undertaker. So look forward to another graveyard-centric build featuring him coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, we have 3 contenders from the Modern Horizons 3 set proper vying for your votes. Those being the Landfall and Dredging Plant, the Necrobloom, the Sacrificing and Mass Reanimating Elder Demon, Shilgengar Sire of Famine, and the Bear Transforming Bear, Kudo King Among Bears. So be sure to cast your votes, link in the description, before the deadline on June 28th, and let me know in the comments which commander you voted for, and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.